Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and, frankly, deeply complex issue, South Africa's two-front war against climate change. You see, on one side, we have this visceral, immediate need for adaptation, literally protecting communities from devastating extreme weather right now. But on the other side, there's this high-stakes, macroeconomic fight for mitigation, which means restructuring an entire national grid and economy. It's an absolutely massive challenge, and the steps being taken are incredibly illuminating. Okay, let's dive into this, because to truly understand the scale of what we're dealing with, we have to start by looking right here at the physical reality on the ground. This captures the sheer devastation in KwaZulu-Natal, specifically in and around Durban, also known as the eThekwini municipality. Back in April 2022, this area essentially became ground zero for the climate crisis in South Africa. We aren't just talking about a bad storm here, we're looking at the catastrophic intersection of extreme weather and highly vulnerable human settlements. To make sense of how a localized disaster like that shapes national and global policy, here is our roadmap for today. 1. A climate disaster unfolds. 2. Cost of the floods. 3. Funding the energy transition. 4. Taxing carbon emissions. And finally, 5. Building climate resilience. We're going to bridge the gap between tragic meteorological disasters and high-level national finance.
So, Section 1. A climate disaster unfolds. The anatomy of a storm. Because we really have to understand the rapid onset physical impacts before we can even begin to talk about the long-term policy response. What happened was a sequence of meteorological events that just compounded into an absolute nightmare scenario. Heavy rains kicked off around April 8th, driven by a La Niña weather pattern that had already left the region's water table exceptionally high. Then, right between April 11th and 12th, this moisture-packed low-pressure system evolved and intensified into what Meteofronts actually designated as subtropical depression Isa. The sheer volume of water was totally unprecedented. To put that into perspective for you, in a single 24-hour period, Virginia Airport down in Durban recorded 304 millimeters of rain. And tragically, just as the recovery started getting underway, a secondary storm hit on May 21st, causing even more displacement.
Let's just pause for a moment to let this number sink in. 436. That is the number of confirmed lives lost across the province. This horrific human toll makes the April 2022 floods one of the deadliest disasters in South Africa's entire 21st century. It's a sobering reminder that behind every single climate statistic we talk about today, there is a profound human tragedy. And it's the most vulnerable communities, especially those living in informal settlements along steep hillsides and floodplains, that end up bearing the absolute heaviest burden.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer physical force of the water. The floods completely washed away critical infrastructure across the province, just destroying pipelines and roadways. And, these weren't just roads, they were literal lifelines. Key aqueducts that supply the Durban Heights Reservoir failed completely, telecommunication towers were knocked out, major substations flooded, and even a hydroelectric dam operated by Eskom was just totally overwhelmed by the rising waters. Entire communities were completely isolated, severed from their basic water and power supplies.
Which brings us to Section 2, Cost of the floods. We need to shift our focus from the immediate human tragedy and tally up the massive economic toll at the provincial level.
17 billion rand. That is the staggering estimated cost of the infrastructure damage across KwaZulu-Natal. This was not just some localized problem. It was a massive, sweeping blow to the province's entire economy. The destruction was so severe that it effectively erased an estimated 1.8% of the city of Durban's annual GDP, just like that.
And you can see how that disaster rippled outward, touching virtually every sector of the local economy. Manufacturing took a massive 431 million rand hit, with major companies like Sappi actually being forced to close their flooded paper mills. Transport and logistics networks became completely impassable, heavily impacting the port of Durban, which had to suspend operations and disrupt supply chains far, far beyond the province's borders. Even agriculture, wholesale, and construction suffered multi-million rand damages.
All right, Section 3, Funding the Energy Transition. Let's look at the global response.
So, we've seen the muddy, devastating reality on the ground in KZN. But mitigating the root cause of these extreme weather patterns means we have to pivot. We have to look at the ledgers of the national treasury and the mechanisms of global finance. Mitigation requires massive capital. Because of the stark reality of disasters like the KZN floods, South Africa knows that systemic changes are required to lower emissions and prevent future warming. The whole energy grid needs to be transformed away from coal, and that brings us to a pioneering model of climate finance, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP. Contrast this massive financial figure with the flood statistics we just went over, $13.7 billion US dollars. According to the 2025 12-month update, this is the total mobilized global pledge for South Africa's energy transition. It's just a colossal sum of money, and it's designed to align international finance with the nation's domestic climate goals.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when we break down where that money is actually coming from. The International Partners Group, which is made up of the UK, Denmark, the EU, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, they're putting forward $10 billion. The remaining $3.7 billion comes from multilateral development banks and other bilateral pledges. What's really notable here is that this international support is holding strong even despite the United States formally withdrawing its $1 billion pledge early in 2025.
So what is this funding actually doing on the ground? Well, the reforms are vast. A highly anticipated South African wholesale electricity market is scheduled to launch in April 2026. Physically speaking, the country is preparing to construct more than 14,000 kilometers of transmission lines over the next decade to accommodate new, decentralized renewable power. Meanwhile, the state utility Eskom has shown some really positive trajectories, announcing its first return to profitability since the 2017 financial year. All of this enables South Africa to push for an updated emissions target, aiming to cap greenhouse gases between 320 and 380 megatons by 2035.
Moving right along to Section 4, taxing carbon emissions. This is the domestic policy front. Because, alongside that international funding, the government is utilizing very strict domestic policies to force local businesses to account and pay for their own emissions. Up until December 2025, during Phase 1 of the carbon tax, the rate was set at 236 Rand per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. But the National Treasury's 2026 budget introduces a much stricter financial reality for corporate emitters. From January 1, 2026 onwards, that rate jumps to 308 Rand per ton. So the absolutely crucial point here is this figure, 31%. This represents the largest single jump in the carbon tax rate since the system was first implemented back in 2019. It is explicitly designed to act as a powerful, unavoidable financial incentive for major corporations to actively lower their emissions and get their corporate strategies in line with the country's climate goals.
But hey, policy's rarely black and white, right? And there's a fascinating, surprising nuance here. The government is actively balancing these ambitious climate goals with the very real, very current energy crisis in South Africa. Recognizing that a lot of businesses only run diesel generators just to survive periods of load shedding, the 2026 budget proposes an annual emissions threshold of 25,000 tons. If you're just using backup generators and you fall into this limit, you're spared the disproportionate compliance burden. It provides some much-needed relief during periods of grid instability.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5. Building climate resilience, how we prepare for the future. We've talked about global billions and national tax policies, but we really must bring this macro-level narrative back down to the local human level, because the hard truth is the next storm is inevitable. I want you to consider this quote from the Presidential Climate Commission's issue brief. Disasters can become threat multipliers and undermine previous development gains. The research emphasizes over and over again that vulnerable communities bear the absolute disproportionate burden of these impacts. So when the next floods come, rebuilding simply cannot focus just on restoration, putting things back exactly the way they were. It has to focus on resilience.
Let's move to and see how this builds into actionable steps. The Commission outlines a few key things. It starts with climate-smart spatial planning to prevent settlements in high-risk flood zones in the first place. Next up is implementing robust community-based early warning systems. Innovations like the Palmiate catchment system have already proven super effective in making sure highly vulnerable informal settlers can evacuate in time. Furthermore, infrastructure must be built to be climate resilient, and all of this has to be wrapped in a framework of regenerative sustainability, enhancing society's ability to not just bounce back, but bounce back better.
Which leads us with a final, truly provocative question. South Africa is mobilizing billions in global finance. They're rapidly reforming the energy grid and heavily taxing domestic carbon emissions. But can these bureaucratic and financial mitigation efforts actually move fast enough to outpace the sheer physical reality of a changing climate? Can the ledgers of finance outrun the rising waters? It's a question that South Africa, and indeed the entire world, will be forced to answer in the years to come. Thanks for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.